Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. So, week 3, we are still reading A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. And we'll do a recap. I was thinking earlier today about my recaps and how the recaps are going to need to get shorter as we get further into the book. So I haven't really haven't done my homework for this. So let's see how it goes. Chapter 1, Warriors in the Mist. We have a main character. His name is Ged, or Dunny was his childhood name. Young boy from the island of Gaunt, an island in the archipelago of Earthsea, known for mountains and wizards. Turned out he had some natural inclinations of the wizardly sort, trained with his aunt, who was the village witch. His mother was dead. His dad was dour. His village got attacked. Lo and behold, he saved his village with magic, and nobody had ever expected such a thing. Then he went to live with the wizard on the island, and they were a little bit oil and water. They were both very fine people, but he was an arrogant, talkative little boy, and he was a quiet, taciturn sort of wizard. But they did their thing for a while, and he taught him some things, and then he did a spell he wasn't supposed to do, and that didn't really go so well. And then the wizard said, "Hey, you want to keep living with me? You really should, because I can teach you to chill out and not be an arrogant prick." But he was like, Dunny, Ged, Sparrowhawk, all the same person, was like, "No, I'm going to go to the Isle of Roke, where the wizard school is, because that's what I want to do. So I'm going to learn to be a wizard, and I'm going to be powerful, and that's what's good in the world." So he goes to Roke, and more things happen. He's still arrogant, and he meets some other characters that hopefully you remember, and put on some boats. Let's see here. He's still at the school. I don't want to say too much, so I got to flip through the book and see what you all know versus what I know, because I know a little more about this book than maybe you all know right now. So he learned things at school, but he wanted to learn more, and he wanted to turn things into, really like change the form of things. And he was kind of told, "Hey, buddy, that's a little dangerous. You got to be careful. Slow your roll there, bub. Rocks are important." Things such as a rock is a good thing too, If the Isles of Earthsea were all made of diamond, we'd lead a hard life here. Enjoy illusions, lad, and let the rocks be rocks. But Ged left dissatisfied. Blah, 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 blah. His nemesis, Jasper, is really pissing him off. And they're really getting at each other. And they did spellboat races in the harbor and feats of illusion. And the first few months went fast, full of passions and wonder. And that's where we ended last week. Starting a new season on page 62 of our book, Winter. And here we go. In winter, it was different. He was sent with 7 other boys across Roke Island to the farthest northmost cape, where stands the Isolate Tower. There, by himself, lived the master namer, who was called by a name that had no meaning in any language. Karamerk. No farm or dwelling lay within miles. It stood above the northern cliffs. Gray were the clouds over the seas of winter. Endless the lists and ranks and rounds of name that the namer's 8 pupils must learn. Amongst them, in the tower's high room, Kuramarak sat on a high seat, writing down lists of names that must be learned before the ink faded at midnight, leaving the parchment blank again. Excuse me. It was cold and half dark, and always silent there, except for the scratching of the master's pen and the sighing, maybe, of a student who must learn before midnight the name of every cape, point, bay, sound, inlet, channel, harbor, shallows, reef, and rock of the shores of Losso, a little islet in the Pelnish Sea. If the student complained, the master might say nothing, but lengthen the list. Or he might say, he who would be sea master must know the true name of every drop of water in the sea. Ged sighed sometimes, but he did not complain. He saw that in this dusty and fathomless matter of learning the true name of every place, thing, and being, the power he wanted lay like a jewel at the bottom of a dry well. For magic consists in this, the true naming of a thing. So Kuramaruk had said to them once on their first night in the tower. He never repeated it, but Ged did not forget his words. Quote, many a mage of great power, he had said, has spent his whole life to find out the name of one single thing, one single lost or hidden name. And still the lists are not finished, nor will they be till the world's end. Listen, and you will see why. In the world under the sun, and in the other world that has no sun, there is much that has nothing to do with men and men's speech, and there are but magic, true magic, is worked only by those who speak the Hardic tongue of Earthsea, or the old language dragons speak, and the language Segoi spoke, who made the islands of the world, and the language of our lays and songs, spells, enchantments, and invocations. Its words lie hidden and changed among our Hardic words. He called the foam on the waves Sukian. That word is made from two words of the old speech, suk, feather, and Inian, the sea. Feather of the sea is foam, but you cannot charm foam calling it Sukian. You must use its own true name in the old speech, which is Essa. Any witch knows a few of these words in the old speech, and a mage knows many, but there are many more, and some have been lost over the ages, and some have been hidden, and some are known only to dragons and the old powers of earth, and some are known to no living creature, and no man could learn them all, for there is no end to that language. Here is the reason. The sea's name is Inian, well and good, but what we call the inmost sea has its own name, also in the old speech. Since no thing can have two true names, Inian can only mean all the sea except the inmost sea. And of course, it does not mean even that, for there are seas and bays and straits beyond counting that bear names of their own. So if some mage sea master were mad enough to try to lay a spell of storm or calm over all the ocean, his spell must not say only the word Inian, but the name of every stretch and bit and part of the sea through all the archipelago and all the outer reaches and beyond it where names cease. Thus, that which gives us power to work magic sets the limits of that power. A mage can control only what is near him, and he can name. A mage can control only what is near him, what he can name exactly and wholly, and this is well. If it were not so, the wickedness of the powerful or the folly of the wise would long ago have sought to change what cannot be changed, and equilibrium would fail. The unbalanced sea would overwhelm the islands where we perilously dwell, and in the old silence, all voices and all names would be lost. Ged thought long on these words, and they went deep in his understanding. Yet the majesty of the task could not make the work that long year in the tower less hard and dry. And at the end of the year, Kurum Karmarak said to him, you have made a good beginning, but no more. Wizards speak truth. And it was true that all the mastery of names that Ged had toiled to win that year was the mere start of what he must go on learning all his life. He was let go from the isolate tower sooner than those that had come with him, for he had learned quicker, but that was all the praise he got. He walked south across the island, alone in the early winter, along townless, empty roads. As night came on, it rained. He said no charm to keep the rain off him, for the weather of Roke was in the hands of the master wind key and might not be tampered with. He took shelter under a great pendic tree, and lying there wrapped in his cloak, he thought of his old master Ogion, who might still be on his autumn wanderings over the heights of Gaunt, sleeping out with leafless branches for a roof and falling rain for house walls. That made Ged smile, for he found the thought of Ogion always a comfort to him. He fell asleep with a peaceful heart, and there in the cold darkness full of the whisper of waters. At dawn waking, he lifted his head. The rain had ceased. He saw, sheltered in the folds of his cloak, a little animal curled up asleep, which had crept there for warmth. He wondered, seeing it, for it was a rare, strange beast, an otak. These creatures were found only on 4 southern isles of the archipelago, Roke, Ensmer, Podi, and Wathort. They are small and sleek, with broad faces and fur dark brown or brindle, and great bright eyes. Their teeth are cruel and their temper fierce, so they are not made pets of. They have no call or cry or any voice. Ged stroked this one, and it woke and yawned, showing a small brown tongue and white teeth, and it was not afraid. Otak, he said, and then remembering the 1,000 names of beasts he had learned in the tower, he called it by its true name in the old speech. Hoeg, do you want to come with me? The otak sat down on his open hand and began to wash its fur. He put it on his shoulder in the folds of his hood, and there it rode. Sometimes during the day, it jumped down and darted off into the woods, but it always came back to him, once with a wood mouse it had caught. He laughed and told it to eat the mouse, for he was fasting, this night being the festival of sun return. So he came in the wet dusk past Roke Knoll and saw bright werelights playing in the rain over the roofs of the great house. And he entered there and was welcomed by his masters and companions in the firelit hall. It was like a homecoming to Ged, who had no home to which he could ever return. He was happy to see so many faces he knew, and happiest to see Vetch come forward to greet him with a wide smile on his dark face. He had missed his friend this year more than he knew. Vetch had been made a sorcerer this fall and was apprenticed no more, but that set no barrier between them. They fell to talking at once, and it seemed to Ged that he said more to Vetch in that first hour than he had said during the whole long year at the isolate tower. The otak still rode on his shoulder, nestling in the fold of his hood as they sat at dinner at long tables set up for the festival in the hearth hall. Vetch marveled at the little creature, and once put up his hand to stroke it, but the otak snapped its sharp teeth at him. He laughed. They say, Sparrowhawk, that a man favored by a wild beast is a man to whom the old powers of stone and spring speak in human voice. They say gauntish wizards often keep familiars, said Jasper, who sat on the other side of Vetch. Our Lord Nemmerly has his raven, and songs say the Red Mage of Arc led a wild boar on a gold chain. But I never heard of any sorcerer keeping a rat in his hood. At that they all laughed, and Ged laughed with them. It was a merry night, and he was joyful to be with them in the warmth and merriment, keeping festival with his companions. But, like all Jasper ever said to him, the jest set his teeth on edge. That night, the Lord of O was a guest of the school, himself a sorcerer of renown. He had been a pupil of the Archmage and returned sometimes to Roke for the winter festival or the long dance in summer. With him was his lady, slender and young, bright as new copper, her black hair crowned with opals. It was seldom that any woman sat in the halls of the great house, and some of the old masters looked at her sidelong, disapproving. But the young men looked at her with all their eyes. For such a one, said Vetch to Ged, I could work vast enchantments. He sighed and laughed. She is only a woman, Ged replied. And Princess Elfaran was only a woman, said Vetch. And for her sake, all of Enlad was laid waste, and the hero mage of Havnor died, and the island Solia sank beneath the sea. Old tales, said Ged. But then he too began to look at the Lady of O, wondering if indeed this was such mortal beauty as the old tales told of. The master chanter had sung the deed of the young king, and all together had sung the winter carol. Now, when there was a little pause before they all rose from the tables, Jasper got up and went to the table nearest to the hearth, where the Archmage and the guests and masters sat, and he spoke to the Lady of O. Jasper was no longer a boy, but a young man, tall and comely, his cloak clasped at the neck with silver, for he also had been made sorcerer this year, and the silver clasp was the token of it. The lady smiled at what he had said, and the opals shone in her black hair, radiant. Then, the masters nodding benign consent, Jasper worked an illusion charm for her. A white tree he made spring up from the stone floor. Its branches touched the high roof beams of the hall, and on every twig of every branch a golden apple shone, each a sun, for it was the year tree. A bird flew among the branches suddenly, all white with a tail like a fall of snow, and the golden apples, dimming, turned to seeds, each one a drop of crystal. Then, falling from the tree with a sound like rain, all at once there came a sweet fragrance, while the tree, swaying, put forth leaves of rosy fire and white flowers like stars. So the illusion faded. The Lady of O cried out with pleasure and bent her shining head to the young sorcerer in praise of his mastery. Come with us, live with us in Otokne, where he cannot come. Oh, can he not come, my lord? She asked, childlike, of her stern husband. But Jasper said only, when I have learned skills worthy of my masters here, and worthy of your praise, my lady, then I will gladly come and serve you ever gladly. So he pleased all there, except Ged. Ged joined his voice to the praises, but not his heart. I could have done better, he said to himself in bitter envy. and all the joy of the evening was darkened for him after that. Chapter 4, The Loosing of the Shadow. That spring, Ged saw little of either Vetch or Jasper, for they, being sorcerers, studied now with the master patterner in the secrecy of the imminent grove, where no prentice might set foot. Ged stayed in the great house, working with the masters at all the skills practiced by sorcerers, those weatherworking, finding, and binding, and the arts of spellsmiths and spellwrights, tellers, chanters, heal-alls, and herbalists. At night, alone in his sleeping cell, a little ball of wear-light burning above the book in place of lamp or candle, he studied the further runes and the runes of A, which are used in the great spells. All these crafts came easy to him, and it was rumored among the students that this master or that had said that the Gauntish lad was the quickest student that had ever been at Roke, and tales grew up concerning the Otok, which was said to be a disguised spirit who whispered wisdom in Ged's ear, and it was even said that the Archmage's raven had hailed Ged at his arrival as Archmage to be. Whether or not they believed such stories, and whether or not they liked Ged, most of his companions admired him, and were eager to follow him when the rare wild mood came over him, and he joined them to lead their games on the lengthening evenings of spring. But for the most part, he was all work and pride and temper, and held himself apart. Among them all, Vetch being absent, he had no friend, and never knew he wanted one. He was 15, very young to learn any of the high arts of a wizard or mage, those who carry the staff, but he was so quick to learn all the arts of illusion that the master changer, himself a young man, soon began to teach him apart from the others, and to tell him about the true spells of shaping. He explained how if a thing is really to be changed into another thing, it must be renamed for as long as the spell lasts. And he told how this affects the names and natures of things surrounding the transformed thing. He spoke of the perils of changing, above all when the wizard transforms his own shape, and thus is liable to be caught in his own spell. Little by little, drawn on by the boy's sureness of understanding, the young master began to do more than tell him of these mysteries. He taught him first one and then another of the great spells of change, and gave him the book of shaping to study. This he did without knowledge of the Archmage, and unwisely, yet he meant no harm. Ged worked also with the master summoner now, but that master was a stern man, aged and hardened by the deep and somber wizardry he taught. He dealt with no illusion, only true magic, the summoning of such energies as light and heat, and the force that draws the magnet. Oh, look at that. But I've lost my place now. He dealt with no illusion, only true magic, the summoning of such energies as light and heat, and the force that draws the magnet, and those forces men perceive as weight, form, color, sound. Real powers drawn from the immense, fathomless energies of the universe, which no man's spells or uses could exhaust or unbalance. The weather workers and the sea masters calling upon wind and water were crafts already known to his pupils, but it was he who showed them why the true wizard uses such spells only at need, since to summon up such earthly forces is to change the earth of which they are a part. Rain on Roke may be drought in Oskill, he said, and calm in the East Reach may be storm and ruin in the West, unless you know what you are about. As for the calling of real things and living people, and the raising up of spirits of the dead, and the invocations of the unseen, whose spells are the height of the summoner's art and the mage's power, those he scarcely spoke of to them. Once or twice, Ged tried to lead him to talk a little of such mysteries, but the master was silent, looking at him long and grimly. Now Ged grew uneasy and said no more. Sometimes, indeed, he was uneasy working even such lesser spells as the summoner taught him. There were certain runes on certain pages of the lore book that seemed familiar to him, though he did not remember in what book he had ever seen them before. There were certain phrases that must be said in spells of summoning that he did not like to say. They made him think, for an instant, of shadows in a dark room, of a shut door, and shadows reaching out to him from the corner by the door. Hastily, he put such thoughts or memories aside and went on. Those moments of fear and darkness, he said to himself, were the shadows merely of his ignorance. The more he learned, the less he would have to fear, until finally, in his full power as a wizard, he need fear nothing in the world, nothing at all. In the second month of that summer, all the school gathered again at the great house to celebrate the moon's night and the long dance. Excuse me. Which that year fell together as one festival of 2 nights, which happens but once in 52 years. All the first night, the shortest night of full moon of the year, flutes played out in the fields, and the narrow streets of Thwill were full of drums and torches. And the sound of singing went out over the moonlit waters of Roke Bay. As the sun rose next morning, the chanters of Roke began to sing the long deed of Earthsea, which tells how the white towers of Havnor were built, and of Earthsea's journeys from the old island, A, through all the archipelago and the reaches, until at last, in the uttermost west reach, on the edge of the open sea, he met the dragon Orm, and his bones in shattered armor lie among the dragon's bones on the shore of lonely Celador. But his sword, set atop the highest tower of Havnor, still burns red in the sunset above the inmost sea. When the chant was finished, the long dance began. Townsfolk and masters and students and farmers all together, men and women, danced in the warm dust and dusk down all the roads of Roke. They danced in the warm dust and dusk down all the roads of Roke to the sea beaches, to the beat of drums and drone of pipes and flutes. Straight out into the sea they danced, under the moon one night past full, and the music was lost in the breakers' sound. As the east grew light, they came back up the beaches and the roads, the drums silent, and only the flutes playing soft and shrill. So it was done on every island of the archipelago that night. One dance, one music, binding together the sea-divided lands. When the long dance was over, most people slept the day away, and gathered again at evening to eat and drink. There was a group of young fellows, prentices and sorcerers, who had brought their supper out from the refectory to hold a private feast in a courtyard of the great house. Vetch, Jasper, and Ged were there, and 6 or 7 others, and some young lads released briefly from the isolate tower. For this festival had brought even Kermark out. They were all eating and laughing and playing such tricks out of pure frolic as might be the marvel of a king's court. One boy had lighted the court with 100 stars of wearlight, colored like jewels, that swung in a slow, netted procession between them and the real stars. And a pair of boys were playing bowls with balls of green flame and bowling pins that leaped and hopped away as the ball came near. And all the while, Vetch sat cross-legged, eating roast chicken up in midair. One of the younger boys tried to pull him down to earth, but Vetch merely drifted up a little higher, out of reach, and sat calmly smiling in the air. Now and then he tossed away a chicken bone, which turned to an owl and flew hooting among the netted starlights. Ged shot breadcrumb arrows after the owls and brought them down, and when they touched the ground, there they lay, bone and crumb, all illusion gone. Ged also tried to join Vetch up in the middle of the air, but lacking the key of the spell, he had to flap his arms to keep aloft, and they were all laughing at his flights and flaps and bumps. He kept up his foolishness for the laughter's sake, laughing with them, for after those 2 long nights of dance and moonlight and music and majory, he was in a fey and wild mood, ready for whatever might come. He came lightly down to his feet, just beside Jasper at last, and Jasper, who never laughed aloud, moved away, saying, "The sparrowhawk can't fly." "Is Jasper a precious stone?" Ged returned, grinning. "O jewel among sorcerers, O gem of Havnor, sparkle for us." The lad that had set the lights dancing sent one down to dance and glitter upon Jasper's head. Not quite as cool as usual, frowning, Jasper brushed the light away and snuffed it out with one gesture. "I am sick of boys and noise and foolishness," he said. "You're getting middle-aged, lad," Vetch remarked from above. "If silence and gloom is what you want," put in one of the younger boys, "you could always try the tower." Ged said to him, "What is it you want then, Jasper?" "I want the company of my equals," Jasper said. "Come on, Vetch, leave the prentices to their toys." Ged turned to face Jasper. "What do sorcerers have that prentices lack?" he inquired. His voice was quiet, but all the other boys suddenly felt still, for in his tone, as in Jasper's, the spite between them now sounded plain and clear as steel coming out of a sheath. "Power," Jasper said. "I'll match your power act for act." "You challenge me?" "I challenge you." Vetch had dropped down to the ground, and now he came between them, grim of face. "Duels in sorcery are forbidden to us, and well you know it. Let this cease." Both Ged and Jasper stood silent, for it was true they knew the law of Roke, and they also knew that Vetch was moved by love, and themselves by hate. Yet their anger was balked, not cooled. Presently, moving a little aside, as if to be heard by Vetch alone, Jasper spoke with a cool smile. "I think you'd better remind your goatherd friend again of the law that protects him." "He looks sulky. I wonder, did he really think I'd accept a challenge from him? A fellow who smells of goats, a prentice who doesn't know the first change?" "Jasper," said Ged, "what do you know of what I know?" For an instant, with no word spoken that any heard, Ged vanished from their sight, and where he stood, a great falcon hovered, opening its hooked beak to scream. For one instant, and then Ged stood there again in the flickering torchlight, his dark gaze on Jasper. Jasper had taken a step backward, in astonishment. But now he shrugged and said one word, illusion. The others muttered. Vetch said, that was not illusion. It was true change, and enough. Jasper, listen. Enough to prove that he sneaked a look in the book of shaping behind the master's back. What then? Go on, goatherd. I like this trap you're building for yourself. The more you try to prove yourself my equal, the more you show yourself for what you are. At that, Vetch turned from Jasper and said very softly to Ged, Sparrowhawk, will you be a man and drop this now? Come with me. Ged looked at his friend and smiled, but all he said was, keep Hoag for me a little while, will you? He put into Vetch's hands the little otak, which as usual had been riding on his shoulder. It had never let any but Ged touch it, but it came to Vetch now, and climbing up his arm, cowered on his shoulder, its great bright eyes always on its master. Now, Ged said to Jasper, quietly, as before, what are you going to do to prove yourself my superior, Jasper? I don't have to do anything, goatherd. Yet I will. I will give you a chance, an opportunity. Envy eats you like a worm in an apple. Let's get out the worm. Once, by Roke Knoll, you boasted that gauntish wizards don't play games. Come to Roke Knoll now and show us what it is they do instead. And afterward, maybe I will show you a little sorcery. Yes, I should like to see that, Ged answered. The younger boys, used to seeing his black temper break out at the least hint of slight or insult, watched him in wonder at his coolness now. Vetch watched him not in wonder, but with growing fear. He tried to intervene again, but Jasper said, come, keep out of this, Vetch. What will you do with the chance I give you, goatherd? Will you show us an illusion, a fireball, a charm to cure goats with the mange? What would you like me to do, Jasper? The older lad shrugged. Summon up a spirit from the dead for all I care. I will. You will not. Jasper looked straight at him, rage suddenly flaming out over his disdain. You will not. You cannot. You brag and brag. By my name, I will do it. They all stood utterly motionless for a moment, breaking away from Vetch, who would have led him back by main force. Ged strode out of the courtyard, not looking back. The dancing wear-lights overhead died out, sinking down. Jasper hesitated a second, then followed after Ged, and the rest came straggling behind in silence, curious and afraid. The slopes of Roke Knoll went up dark into the darkness of summer night before moonrise. The presence of that hill where many wonders had been worked was heavy, like a weight in the air about them. As they came onto the hillside, they thought of how the roots of it were deep, deeper than the sea, reaching down even to the old, blind, secret fires at the world's core. They stopped on the east slope. Stars hung over the black grass above them on the hill's crest. No wind blew. Ged went a few paces up the slope from the others, and turning, said in a clear voice, Jasper, whose spirit shall I call? Call whom you like. None will listen to you. Jasper's voice shook a little, with anger perhaps. Ged answered him softly, mockingly. Are you afraid? He did not even listen for Jasper's reply, if he made one. He no longer cared about Jasper. Now that they stood on Roke Knoll, hate and rage were gone. replaced by utter certainty. He need envy no one. He knew that his power this night on this dark, enchanted ground was greater than it had ever been, filling him till he trembled with the sense of strength barely kept in check. He knew now that Jasper was far beneath him, had been sent perhaps only to bring him here tonight, no rival, but a mere servant of Ged's destiny. Under his feet, he felt the hill roots going down and down into the dark, and over his head he saw the dry, far fires of the stars. Between all things were his to order, to command. He stood at the center of the world. Don't be afraid, he said, smiling. I'll call a woman's spirit. You need not fear a woman. Elpharan I will call, the fair lady of the deed of Enlad. She died 1,000 years ago. Her bones lie far underneath the sea of A, and perhaps there never was such a woman. Do years and distances matter to the dead? Do the songs lie? Ged said with the same gentle mockery, and then saying, watch the air between my hands. He turned away from the others and stood still. In a great, slow gesture, he stretched out his arms, the gesture of welcome that opens an invocation. He began to speak. He had read the runes of this spell of summoning in Ogion's book 2 years and more ago, and never since had he seen them. In darkness, he had read them then. Now, in this darkness, it was as if he read them again on the page open before him in the night. But now he understood what he read, speaking it aloud, word after word, and he saw the markings of how the spell must be woven in the sound of his voice and the motion of body and hand. The other boys stood watching, not speaking, not moving unless they shivered a little, for the great spell was beginning to work. Ged's voice was soft still, but changed, with a deep singing in it, and the words he spoke were not known to them. He felt silent. Suddenly the wind rose roaring in the grass. Ged dropped to his knees and called out aloud. Then he fell forward as if to embrace earth with his outstretched arms, and when he rose, he held something dark in his straining hands and arms, something so heavy that he shook with the effort getting to his feet. The hot wind whined in the black tossing grasses of the hill. If the stars shone now, none saw them. The words of enchantment hissed and mumbled on Ged's lips, and he cried out aloud and clearly, Elpharon! And then he cried the name, Elpharon! And the third time, Elpharon! The shapeless mass of darkness he had lifted split apart. It sundered, and a pale spindle of light gleamed between his opened arms, a faint oval reaching from the ground up to the height of his raised hands. In the oval of light, for a moment, there moved a form, a human shape, a tall woman looking back over her shoulder. Her face was beautiful and sorrowful and full of fear. Only for a moment did the spirit glimmer there. Then the sallow oval between Ged's arms grew bright. It widened and spread, a rent in the darkness of the earth and night, a ripping open of the fabric of the world. Through it blazed a terrible brightness, and through that bright, misshapen breach clamored something like a clot of black shadow, quick and hideous, and it leaped straight out at Ged's face. Staggering back under the weight of the thing, Ged gave a short, hoarse scream. The little Otok, watching from Vetch's shoulder, the animal that had no voice, screamed aloud also and leaped as if to attack. Ged fell, struggling and writhing, while the bright rip in the world's darkness above him widened and stretched. The boys that watched fled, and Jasper bent down to the ground, hiding his eyes from the terrible light. Vetch alone ran forward to his friend. So only he saw the lump of shadow that clung to Ged, tearing at his flesh. It was like a black beast, the size of a young child, though it seemed to swell and shrink, and it had no head or face, only the four-taloned paws with which it gripped and tore. Vetch sobbed with horror, yet he put out his hands to try to pull the thing away from Ged. Before he touched it, he was bound still, unable to move. The intolerable brightness faded, and slowly the torn edges of the world closed together. Nearby, a voice was speaking as softly as a tree whispers or a fountain plays. Starlight began to shine again, and the grasses of the hillside were whitened with the light of the moon just rising. The night was healed. Restored and steady lay the balance of light and dark. The shadow beast was gone. Ged lay sprawled on his back, his arms flung out as if they kept the wide gesture of welcome and invocation. His face was blackened with blood, and there were great black stains on his shirt. The little Otok cowered by his shoulder, quivering, and above him stood an old man whose cloak glimmered pale in the moonrise, the Archmage Nemmerly. The end of Nemmerly's staff hovered silvery above Ged's breast. Once, gently, it touched him over the heart, once on the lips, while Nemmerly whispered. Ged stirred, and his lips parted, gasping for breath. Then the old Archmage lifted his staff and set it to earth, and leaned heavily on it with bowed head, as if he had scarcely strength to stand. Vetch found himself free to move. Looking around, he saw that already others were there, the Master's Summoner, and Changer. An act of great wizardry is not worked without arousing such men, and they had ways of coming very swiftly when need called, though none had been so swift as the Archmage. They now sent for help, and some who came went to the Archmage, while others, Vetch among them, carried Ged to the chambers of the Master Herbal. All night long, the summoner stayed on Roke Knoll, keeping watch. Nothing stirred there on the hillside, where the stuff of the world had been torn open. No shadow came crawling through moonlight, seeking the rent through which it might clamber back into its own domain. It had fled from Nemmerly, and from the mighty spell walls that surround and protect Roke Island. But it was in the world now, in the world somewhere it hid. If Ged had died that night, it might have tried to find the doorway he had opened and follow him into Death's realm, or slip back into whatever place it had come from. For this, the summoner waited on Roke Knoll, but Ged lived. They had laid him a bed in the healing chamber, and the Master Herbal tended the wounds he had on his face and throat and shoulder. They were deep, ragged, and evil wounds. The black blood in them would not stanch, welling out even under the charms and the cobweb-wrapped perio leaves laid upon them. Ged lay blind and dumb in fever, like a stick in a slow fire, and there was no spell to cool what burned him. Not far away, in the unroofed court where the fountain played, the Archmage lay also unmoving, but cold, very cold. Only his eyes lived, watching the fall of moonlit water and the stir of moonlit leaves. Those with him said no spells and worked no healing. Quietly, they spoke among themselves from time to time, and then turned again to watch their lord. He lay still, hawk nose and high forehead, and white hair bleached by moonlight, all to the color of bone. To check the ungoverned spell and drive off the shadow from Ged, Nemerly had spent all his power, and with it his bodily strength was gone. He lay dying. But the death of a great mage, who has many times in his life walked on the dry, steep hillsides of Death's kingdom, is a strange manner, for the dying man does not go blindly. The dying man goes not blindly, but surely, knowing the way. When Nemerly looked up through the leaves of the trees, those with him did not know if he watched the stars of summer fading into daybreak, or those other stars which never set above the hills that see no dawn. The raven of Oskill, that had been his pet for 30 years, was gone. No one had seen where it went. It flies before him, the master patterner said as they kept vigil. The day came warm and clear. The great house and the streets of Thwill were hushed. No voice was raised until along towards noon iron bells spoke out in the chanter's tower, harshly tolling. On the next day, the 9 masters of Roke gathered in a place somewhere under the dark trees of the imminent grove. Even there, they set 9 walls of silence about them, that no person or power might speak to them or hear them, as they chose from amongst all the mages of Earthsea him who would be the new archmage. Genscher of Way was chosen. A ship was set forth at once across the inmost sea to Way Island to bring the archmage back to Roke. The master Winky stood in the stern and raised up the mage wind into the sail, and quickly the ship departed and was gone. Of these events, Ged knew nothing. For 4 weeks of that hot summer, he lay blind and deaf and mute, though at times he moaned and cried out like an animal. At last, as the patient crafts of the master herbal worked their healing, his wounds began to close and the fever left him. Little by little, he seemed to hear again, though he never spoke. On a clear day of autumn, the master herbal opened the shutters of the room where Ged lay. Since the darkness of that night on Roke Knoll, he had known only darkness. Now he saw daylight and the sun shining. He hid his scarred face in his hands and wept. And that brings us to, what's it bring us to? Where's my clock? It brings us to 10:02, and perhaps a dramatic stopping point. Until next week.